And then just set that up so it like kind of has me. I don't know. You can figure that out, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Antonio, how's life? You waiting? Oh, you're waiting for it to be graded.
You just are so sleepy.
I know,
You're mean.
I said good job.
Exactly.
Are we ready to learn?
Yeah.
What?
Who said no? I think Bennington. Bennington, I want.
All right, people, you ready? Hey, new chapter, new week. Not the most exciting topic because it's kind of sad. It's the topic of Indians again, and it's a recurring theme that I guess we've been getting since the very, very beginnings, like with the Mystic River Massacre and the Anglo-Powhatan War. So that's our focus today and a little bit of tomorrow. And let's kind of revisit a few things with Native Americans. One, I would recommend that you see this movie. If you're in my movie club, we're watching it this week. Last week we started it. I believe we're going to continue it tomorrow. But it's a story of this guy who plays a Civil War vet who somehow was lucky and won a battle, and because he won the battle, he got to pick his new post. He wants to go out west. So he goes out west, the army's not there. He ends up finding Indians, likes the Indians, lived with the Indians, but it's not a happy story because it's the continuation of, the white man moves west, then bad things will ultimately happen. This movie won a ton of awards. Has anyone seen it? I really recommend it. So if you're at all into this, I'm going to recommend that movie. And again, I'm even showing it in my movie club. I'm exposing you guys to the atrocities in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. But I would say that represents a notable shift in the historiography. Do you remember I taught you that term?
Yeah.
The changing ways in which history is written. Where for hundreds of years, the history of Native Americans was written from the winner's point of view. Have you ever heard the victors write the history?
Yeah.
And they kind of depict Indians as savages, wild life on the plains, and the horrors of Indian warfare. So they'll depict all sorts of falsehoods about Indians being thieves and beggars and savages, and we've got a whole collection of books that is not all that friendly to the Indian cause. The notable shift is here. In the late 1960s, the Indians were kind of getting together in a big movement for rights again. And this book is the first to tell the story from the Indian point of view. I'm having you guys read the chapter on the Sand Creek Massacre. Once you get into it, it's bad. It's like horrific. It's going to gross you out at times when you see what some of the Americans did to the Indians. That is just one chapter of many in the book. I'd recommend the whole thing to you. You take a college history class, they might assign that entire thing, but at the very least read the chapter on the Sand Creek Massacre. And that's what you're going to see. The changing historiography. Just now, we're still learning like the Indian point of view from a lot of things. Hundreds of years we've been combating the falsehoods that only told one side of the story. You follow me? Let's see how your context is. Being AP scholars, yes, you need to go back to the beginning. In May, you've got to recall it, maybe write a comparative essay of the treatment over Indians. But let's see if you got this. Indian tribe, early 1600s in the Chesapeake. The Powhatan Confederacy with Pocahontas and John Smith, and then who marries Pocahontas? And then they live happily ever after, right? Oh no, there's the first Anglo-Powhatan War, the second Anglo-Powhatan War, the third Anglo-Powhatan War, until all the Indians from the Chesapeake are kind of pushed over here. You got other stories in New England, think Massachusetts. Those are the Pequots. You got the Pequot War and later King Philip's War. You vaguely recall that Mystic River Massacre. The Iroquois held on for much longer. They're in upper state New York. So those were kind of the early stories. And then a recurring theme is they're pushed to the frontier and they eventually all surround themselves around some sort of leader that's going to fight back. Our next chapter is in 1763. You should know the name of the Indian leader they all surround themselves behind. In 1763, it's not Tecumseh. It's Pontiac. So that was Pontiac's famed rebellion, which he ultimately loses. Then they're pushed further to the frontier. Think Ohio Valley, Indiana-ish. That's Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet. Do they win there?
No.
And because of their loss, Andrew Jackson feels justified in doing what in 1830?
Killing them all.
Goes on to Florida.
Andrew Jackson feels authorized and justified to remove them all to the other side of the Mississippi. And then they're supposed to have that land as long as the grass shall grow and the river run. So then it's a happy ending, right? They have that land as long as the grass shall grow and the river run?
No, that was a lie.
Oh no, that's where we pick up now. Because sure enough, with westward expansion, kind of understand when the railroad is built, it's built through the heart of Indian land. So that's going to bring settlers over there. In the 1860s, the government starts to give away farmland. You can make money from ranching. What can you make money from over here?
Nothing. Wait,
Mining. So a whole lot of white people are going into the plains where the Indians are supposed to have that land forever and ever. This quote summarizes it all. Tell your people that since the Great Father promised that we should never be removed, we've been moved 5 times. I think you would better put the Indians on wheels and you can run them about wherever you wish. Yeah. As for the treaties, I would explain the treaty-making process as corrupt, as unfair. Basically, they cheat them off of the Indian land. I believe on the Quizlet I got pretty technical with both of these. These just mark the beginning of that corrupt system on the plains. Like, they moved them to the plains. Why would the Indians agree to move from all that land they had to like the Dakotas and the areas that no one else wanted? Why in the world would they agree to that? Huh?
So they won't die.
Maybe.
They won't be bothered for a long time.
They're cheated out of it. They simply agree to sign these treaties because the government will find a few random Indians, call them chiefs, bribe them a little bit, get them to sign that paper, and then the government says, we got a binding contract, people. And the others might follow in fear of death, because when the government says, we got a binding contract, your chiefs just signed away your land, what options do you have if you don't agree to it? You can fight, but you're probably going to die. You can not agree to the treaty, right? But your options are so limited. So the government is essentially going to force them all onto these smaller reservations in the areas that no one else wants. So there are some fundamental flaws in this process. By living on a reservation, you agree to live in a little square plot of land. How did Indians live prior to that? Were they confined to a little square plot? They're nomadic, chasing the buffalo. Now think about it. What if the buffalo does not roam freely through their little reservation? Now what are they to do? Can't leave. You leave, you're trespassing. Now some farmer or rancher or whoever has that land says an Indian is trespassing, they have authorization to go to war or kill you. Or appeal to the government to get troops saying, hey, these Indians are in rebellion. So think about it, they're essentially handcuffed here, and there are a whole lot of flaws with this reservation system. Some of which stemming from the no buffalo issue, but if there's no food, who's going to provide them with the food?
No.
The government. The government will promise to give them food, but here's where things get messy. And I kind of taught you this when I mentioned the scandals during the Grant administration. Remember, the government's not going to directly give the Indians food. They're going to assign an Indian agent. That Indian agent will then get to spend the money and distribute the food. Keeps a bunch for himself. In fact, that's exactly what happened in the Grant administration. So the Indians are not free to do what they want with the money. They're confined in a bad land, dependent on a corrupt Indian agent, and their old way of life is essentially being destroyed. Oh, there are more problems, as you'll see in a second. Real quick side note, many of the early troops out there patrolling the plains are the nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers, or the black troops out west. You might be familiar with this. There's actually a couple ways you might be. Most of you probably heard the Bob Marley song, Buffalo Soldier. A couple of you may have been to the Houston Buffalo Soldier Museum. They say we have the best one, like one of the best Buffalo Soldier museums in the entire United States is in Houston. So maybe on a museum day you guys can you can go tour the Buffalo Soldier Museum. No?
Let's go.
All right. First, let's get the pronunciation of this down. Sioux. Sioux. Sioux.
See you.
So this is the Dakota Sioux. The Sioux are going to be our biggest tribe of Indians that we're discussing. And they're split among Dakota Sioux, Lakota Sioux. Don't stress all of that too much. But we're looking at the Dakota Sioux. Think like western Minnesota. That's where we are during this uprising. So we're in Minnesota on the other side of the Mississippi. They're on a reservation. And the only way in which they agreed to live on that reservation was in exchange for annuities. What's an annuity? It's a monthly payment. It's as simple as that. So they're on this reservation in the land that they previously didn't want to be on, and the only way in which they agree to live there is by this guaranteed monthly payment by the government. Government's going to pay them money. With that money, they can buy their food, get through life, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But then 1862 comes along. What else is happening in 1862?
Some war probably.
Oh, the Civil War. Meaning the government puts the Indian issue on the back burner and they don't care too much about the tribes. In fact, they outright suspend all the annuities going to this tribe. So they're stuck on this reservation. The government's not paying them. What options do they have?
Kill buffaloes in them.
Well, they first ask for a loan. The Chief Little Crow, and I do have a handful of Indian names in this chapter. I put them all on Quizlet for you. Chief Little Crow basically asked for food on credit. Hey, can we get food now? We'll pay you back later. Possible, right? Many of these traders would be very nice, humanitarian, wanting to give Indians food. Yes?
No. Maybe.
No, this guy's a jerk. The lead trader, Andrew Myrick, his famed quote goes down in the history books because he says, let them eat grass or their own dung. Well, that's not nice, Mr. Myrick. So now I analyze this and I look and I try to figure out what options did the Indians have. They can't leave. The government's not paying them. They can't get a loan. They're backed into a corner. Now what are they going to do?
Revolt.
Now they revolt. So Chief Little Crow will lead them on this revolt. They'll fight their way out of the reservation. They bring together a few other coalitions of other tribes that were around. They attack, and here's the fun part. They seek out Andrew Myrick, and when Myrick's body was found, they found his mouth stuffed full of grass. Yeah, it's not a happy ending to the story, though. So yes, they did get Myrick, but in the end, what's the government always able to do?
Kill them all.
Eventually, the government is able to send enough troops over to put down any insurrection, because we're talking like, what, 500-600 Indians? Yeah, the government has hundreds of thousands, kind of an unlimited military supply that they can eventually focus on the tribe. So eventually, some 400 plus Indians are accused of insurrection, and in mass, they were all deemed guilty and sentenced to death. So basically, every man in the tribe is sentenced to death. It was in a military tribunal. This was the local military sentencing them all to death. In the 1860s, who was the very, very top of the military, the commander-in-chief?
President.
Abraham Lincoln. Thank Lincoln for this. He was kind of nice, emphasis on kind of. Lincoln looked at this mass sentence of 400 plus being ordered to be killed, and he dismissed 350 of the charges as being excessive. But still, you end up with the largest mass hanging in American history. They end up getting like 50 or 60 Indians, all allegedly for insurrection, for revolt against the United States. So it's the largest mass hanging in American history, this Dakota Sioux uprising. Even in death, the aftermath is kind of ugly, by the way. After they're hanged, killed, buried, then they allowed people to basically grave rob and to dig up the shallow graves and take up the bodies, and then they were able to sell the Indian bodies to like colleges and doctors there was an emerging trade of like autopsies and studying the human body. So just kind of think of that with Indian ceremonial type things. All of that was thrown out as well. My DC students are reading Devil in White City. Have any of you ever read that?
No.
There's a whole lot on the emerging like autopsy trade of how you just grave rob and then sell the body to a university or a doctor and they don't ask any questions. So that's what was done with all the Indian dead from this one. How's it reported? Is it reported that they're backed into a corner with all of the context, with the annuity is being suspended,
Nope.
with the trader not giving them food?
Nope.
No, it's reported like this. It's reported like, ooh, look what the Indians did. The Indians are in revolt. The Indians are bad, and therefore the government then focuses on this. It is my purpose to utterly exterminate the Sioux. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people with whom treaties or compromises can be made. Yeah, that's our military post-Civil War. They're essentially going to go to war against the Sioux. And because the Sioux were part of that uprising, they were all then deemed, what, maniacs or beasts. With this, maybe quick slide or screenshot it, take a picture of it. I do have a closing question that might ask you to elaborate on each of these, which are causes of the Indian Wars. I won't go into depth right now. I'll simply tell you there are a whole lot of causes to the Indian Wars. So just kind of think about numerous causes. Like, yeah, the government will isolate them on small reservations. Not everyone follows a treaty. Gold is discovered. There's the railroad factor. There's a whole lot of things that cause the Indian Wars, and just when you sit and reflect on that, it should be pretty easy for you. This is the ugly chapter that I'm having you read. I'm guessing that you haven't started it yet.
Huh?
I don't want to be the spoiler. I really do want you to read this, and when you get to the heart of the massacre that takes place here, just kind of, you'll remember the details when you get to it. So it's a few pages of vivid, gory description of what John Chivington and his Colorado militia does. I'll give you a few quotes from John Chivington. He's the leader of the Colorado militia who hates Indians. He's got quotes saying, kill and scalp all, big and little. He then says, nits make lice, like a baby Indian turns into a problem, is what he's trying to say. And his last quote, probably the most lasting and disturbing, he says, I stand by Sand Creek. Well, you're going to read what happened at Sand Creek. It is bad. Simply, for the most basic summary, it's a very brutal massacre by the Colorado militia on peaceful Indians. These peaceful Indians were promised safety at Sand Creek. They were even given a flag by the American government. As long as that flag was flying, their safety would be clear. Their protection would be evidenced by that flag. They're even flying white little surrender flags during this massacre. You'll kind of see what develops here. He says, I stand by Sand Creek. It's bad when you read it, just be forewarned. 2 years after, Indians fight back and they kill the white man trying to build a road through their land. So kind of think of it as a revenge-seeking massacre on the whites. The Indians do bad things to the white people here. So Fetterman and all of his men will then be killed. And we're talking 80-ish killed here, 200-ish killed there. Guess which one gets reported in mass? The Indian massacre on the white man. The other one, it's the Battle of Sand Creek, where the Indians were resisting, but keep in mind the Indians there were peaceful, promised their safety. So the distortions in history are kind of problematic. There's John Chivington, that's what he looks like. Kill and scalp all, big and little. And that Fetterman massacre, 80 soldiers were killed as they're trying to build a road through Indian territory. The next thing that we look at, Indian territory, where no one else wants. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's hard to live in some of this area, so the Indians have it forever. That is until gold is discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. When gold is discovered there, with those massacres, in very briefly happening before this, the Indians are about to be removed from the Black Hills. And they send over this arrogant Civil War vet who thinks that he can eliminate all of the Indians with one small regiment. This guy's arrogance is going to end up getting him. I got a feeling you know his name. General Custer. He's got 264 men, marches in broad daylight into encamped 2,500
That's dumb.
under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who had never lost a battle before. Custer, by the way, was thinking of running for president. He thought he was an up-and-comer, a Civil War kind of hero, and he thought that if he's able to take out all these Indians in one glorious battle, he might have the springboard to the presidency. Again, he attacks in broad daylight, 264 against 2,500.
He's pretty dumb.
He and every single one of his men will die. Some called it, Custer's last stand, where they fought down to the very last man. That's probably a little bit of whitewashing history where they glorify what the white people did. Custer's last stand, probably not. Again, the guy was a little bit dense in attacking them in broad daylight. But simply understand this is the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we'll kind of reference it as the Battle of Little Bighorn. In the historiography, if you're trying to glorify the white cause, it's Custer's last stand. So kind of the last of the Indian victories. After this, it's about to get ugly. You okay on that? There's a whole lot of, I mean, they've made movies of this. I'm thinking that you might have seen it at some point in your life. We're just scratching the surface, by the way. Every one of these little cross swords represents one of the battles. Any of my Texas history veterans know of the history of the Comanche and any of these battles that take place in Texas?
Oh, yeah.
How were the Comanche treated in Texas?
Probably bad.
Probably bad is a good guess. They did bounties on the Comanche until they were driven out of the state. And if you look at any of the Indian reservations within Texas today, there really aren't any. You got one little small blip around Houston, there's another small blip around Livingston, and then one right over here kind of on the border with Mexico. But for the most part in Texas, they are removed from the state. Some will kind of be recentered over here with the Apache. I do ask that you remember the Apache leader because there are a whole lot of wars in the Southwest led by Geronimo. You've heard of Geronimo, maybe just not understanding the context behind it. But Geronimo, he's going to lead the Apache throughout several years of wars. Same story as always, he loses as well. The other one I ask that you remember is the Nez Perce. Their leader has a famed quote. I'll share the quote with you on the next slide, but they always throw it on the AP test. It's Chief Joseph. And again, I'll show you the quote on the next slide, but he's the Nez Perce leader. And even with that, look how much we're skipping over. Look how much stuff is out there that we just don't really cover.
A lot.
Yeah, so here's the Sioux. They eventually rally together with a bunch of other tribes, but again, they'll lose. Sitting Bull, do you know what happens with him? He ends up getting captured and has to serve in like a sideshow with Buffalo Bill Cody. So that'll be bad. Lots of bad stuff is coming. And this kind of represents the bad. Our chiefs are killed, the old men are dead, the little children are freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children. Hear me, my chiefs, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. Represents the desperation, the losing cause. And I'll say there's one more factor contributing to this. Why is everyone freezing? Why is everyone starving? Their food source is also being killed. The buffalo. Take a look what happens to the buffalo. I know, weird, I put a selfie of me next to a buffalo in a museum. I tried to look serious to reflect the occasion here, but look at the number of buffalo. You go from 15 million, where they're used for everything, down to less than 1,000 in 30 years. Oftentimes, buffalo hides would become like the new beaver, if you think of it that way. Remember how beaver was all the rage worldwide? You wear that beaver hat? Now everyone wants buffalo. A buffalo coat, a buffalo blanket, a buffalo whatever. So oftentimes these hunters would kill the buffalo en masse and just take the hide. Sometimes they would just take the tongue. The tongue would be like a delicacy. But in short, they are killed from 15 million to less than 1,000. It's going to be pretty brutal. Buffalo Bill Cody, He did a number of that. He was hired by the railroads to kill buffalo. That's how he got his nickname. Later, Buffalo Bill's going to have a Wild West show, which we'll talk about again later. But that's that. Does anyone feel bad for the Indians at this time?
Yes.
One person. Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book about it, and she brings about a humanitarian effort. That's where we'll pick up. I got to give you this and explain a political cartoon.
Is that the 17? No, what's 17?
So just get Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor. The title kind of explains it all, right? A Century of Dishonor.
I'll get it.
For a century, the United States has been dishonorable. It's a shift in the historiography. I recommend Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I've got copies. I'll loan them out because I know you guys have so much free time to read.
Is it like Andrew Jackson? Listen, she related to Andrew Jackson?
Doubt it.
She could be.
So depressing.
So let's look at that political cartoon and then try to figure out what's going on with this political cartoon. My big question is, what's the main idea, or what's the author's point of view?
Is it like the polls?
Yeah, what's the polls? Zero in on the polls. What are those people doing? What do you do with the polls? You vote. So you got a bunch of people voting in the background. Look closely at those people.
They're rich white.
How do you know they're rich white men?
Because they're white.
Look at their faces.
They're smiling.
They're smoky.
They're,
Look closer at their faces.
One looks like a monkey.
Bingo. What does the author think about someone if he makes him look like a monkey?
Bad.
Irish, and maybe not quite human. I don't think this cartoonist likes the people that are voting by depicting them as monkeys or monsters or people that look like they're scheming in whatever it is they're doing, stuffing the ballot box, you could say. Right? Do you kind of see it?
Oh, so he's against the, he's in support of the
He is in support of the Indians. This is one of the lone sympathetic voices that is out there. The Indian is being told to move on by this brutish-looking fellow, and the Indian kind of looks sad. You're drawn to the Indian. You feel sympathy towards the Indian when you see this. You're like, wait a minute, all these people have the right to vote? Some of these people are immigrants. Wasn't the Indian born here? They don't get citizenship till the 1920s.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
The 20th century will also be a rocky road for them, which we'll explore later, but
Is there like